Good morning. Welcome. My name is Jason Jedlinski. I am General Manager and Publisher of The Hill. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here this morning to our program on housing and rental markets and accessibility, affordability, and equity in the year ahead. First, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Wells Fargo, for their support of today's event. And this morning, we're going to be exploring the current landscape of housing in America, how ballooning interest rates and rent costs are impacting American families. We'll also take a look at what we can expect in the year ahead, especially during this time of inflation and increased housing demand. We'll be joined by several leaders from Capitol Hill and an exciting lineup of housing experts and economists. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. In addition to our audience here in the room, we're also live streaming this event on thehill.com and YouTube, so please keep your phones on silent for the duration of the program. We encourage you to join the conversation on social media. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at The Hill Events, and we'll be using the hashtag #TheHillHousing. It is my pleasure to welcome our first guest this morning, Congressman French Hill, Ranking Member of the Financial Services Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance. Welcome, Congressman Hill. So I have some brief introductory notes, and I thought, given your expertise working in the Bush senior administration in finance and economic policy, you've been a commercial banker and investment manager, executive secretary to the President's Economic Policy Council. With that kind of background, help us frame the conversation that we're going to be having for the next couple hours. We see inflation affecting the cost of everything right now, not just housing. And we're also seeing a hot housing market that's become unattainable for many Americans. How did we get here? Can you help rewind and put the pieces together?
Well, we don't want to belabor it, but it's certainly driving a lot of the concerns that we have with housing. If you think about accessibility to housing, affordability of housing, constraints on supply, all those are connected with what we're experiencing in the economy. And it's been compounded by the war in Ukraine. It's been compounded by the pandemic. But this underlying inflation, I think, comes from two principal sources. One, we've forgotten that consensus that we had in this country that large deficits are bad and that too much borrowing is bad. And I think both political parties have had that for decades. Not very good at balancing the budget, but periodically getting close, there's that consensus. And in the pandemic unleashed this just money spending madness. We spend about $4.5 trillion every year to run the government. We approved $5 trillion in spending to try to fight the pandemic. And since President Biden's been in office, he's authorized and appropriated another $5 trillion on top of that annualized spending. So we have too many dollars chasing too few goods, classic definition. This happened in the 60s and 70s as well. Secondly, when we went into the pandemic, the Federal Reserve, and I was on the CARES Act Oversight Commission, working routinely with Secretary Mnuchin and Jay Powell, trying to structure and oversee those programs at the Fed to get us out of the ditch of the pandemic. But we had a fundamental flaw, I think, both that we talked about then and in hindsight with the benefit of more color on what's happened. You have a 9% output decline, 21% unemployment, a sharp decline because were we in an economic crisis? No. We were in a public health crisis that then the government agreed to shut the economy down. Then that's very different because the concept would be, well, then if the public health crisis ends, then the government would lift those and people would go back to work. And in fact, that is what happened. We found that we were going to have a vaccine, that we were going to put our kids back in school. And in August of 2020, 80% of Arkansas kids were back in school. People were back at work, maybe not in the Beltway, but they were out across the country. And so you did have a V-shaped recovery for incomes and employment. That's the point. And we had a stimulus of that fiscal stimulus and the actions of the Federal Reserve that were almost a third of GDP. So fiscal policy and monetary policy were too luxuriant, too accommodative, and that continues. And that is the underlying reason for inflation, but made worse by supply chain disruption,
right,
No question about that. And no one is sugarcoating that. And you see that in housing par excellence. We're a big lumber producing state in Arkansas. And we saw those mills shut down by the public health crisis. And it was very hard to get those mills back open and back up to production. And you saw that springtime 2020 spike in lumber prices. And because all that demand money we just talked about, what did people go do? They took that savings and they went out and bought a new house. Or they saw that they could get their big salary but not have to live in the urban area, and they could move. And so you had this huge housing demand at the exact moment that we had supply constraints. So
it is a perfect storm in many ways.
Yeah, it's a perfect storm.
And given the Inflation Reduction Act, what are you expecting both in Arkansas and beyond as a result of that?
Well, I don't know that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to live up to its name. But I do think that if we want to get inflation under control, we should go back to pre-pandemic spending debates, go back to fighting with each other in the political parties to get to a balanced budget, close as possible, stop burdening our future generations with enormous debt. We should unleash all of the above American energy to bring down energy prices, help our allies abroad. We should not add burdensome regulation to the economy that's trying to keep people employed, and we should not, raise taxes on manufacturers and producers.
In the late 80s, early 90s, I know you were instrumental in historic negotiations in Japan and sort of post-Berlin War funding and economic policy in Europe. Anything you take from those experiences that could be applied domestically at this moment in time?
Well, I think we've seen a real challenge between the United States and Europe, Japan with trade policies in China. And they were very reminiscent of how Americans felt about Japan in the late 1980s. They loved the Japanese, but the Japanese had very strong constraints to keep American products out of Japan. And the trade environment in Japan and the United States was all about breaking down those barriers. And what's happened now in China is we've failed to break down those barriers in China, and China has become an economic, diplomatic, military rival to the U.S. and Europe, and so it's really making that trade environment very challenging. But I'll say this, I spent many years in Eastern Europe after the Berlin Wall fell, and I want to reiterate America's partnership with Europe to eject Putin out of Ukraine. And that's a challenge. It's a fiscal challenge. It's a leadership challenge. It's a diplomatic challenge. But based on my experience of being in Europe, working on behalf of President Bush in 1992 and 1993 following the wall, or 91 and 92 following the wall's collapse in 89, you see modern Europe today, and people want to go backwards to, Peter the Great. I mean, this is nuts.
Yeah.
And so we need to make sure that Europe is allowed to be the democratic Western society that it wants to be.
Coming back home around housing, I know you've sponsored and introduced legislation to modernize community development block grant funding. What role do you expect that to have with HUD in terms of improving access and equity to affordable housing?
The CDBG program was the aggregation of all the Nixon Ford programs rolled into a block grant for cities to use. It was meant to be flexible. President Reagan in the early 80s reiterated that we like the block grant approach. We don't like where government goes in and builds public infrastructure like they did with the Urban Development Action Grant, UDAG, which the Reagan administration abolished, where we were going and buying building parking decks for wealthy ball teams and things like that. So CDBGs to be driven locally and to have that flexibility. But I'd like to look at the formula. 50% of the triggering in formula for an entitlement city is what was your pre-1940 housing stock? Okay, well, that's a pretty outdated definition, and it might be great for Cleveland, who had 1 million more people in Cleveland in 1936, 1940 than they do today. But what about Dallas, Los Angeles, Houston, the growth of America? Do you really want entitlement cities to have 50% of the definition of CDBG to be based on what their pre-1940 housing stock was. So I think we ought to look at modernizing that definition. We ought to consider the 27 approved uses for CDBG. To the staff here, it may not sound very controversial. Sounds very common sense what I just say, but you are tinkering with, an entitlement program that mayors count on.
What are some of the factors you would substitute for that 50% that's currently?
I don't know. I think we should have hearings on it. We've never even reauthorized that program. The last time we had a serious hearing on CDBG was, I think, 2005, 2006. So Congress ought to hold hearings on this, ought to get the views of mayors, get the views of county officials in rural states that don't have an entitlement city based on population, and we ought to look at it and see if we can't find a consensus on modernizing it.
On a related note, you recently signed a letter to the Federal Housing Finance Agency seeking more oversight for Fannie and Freddie. Tell us about that.
So one of the big undone challenges, I think, facing American housing finance is the fact that after the financial crisis, we put Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, our two big secondary mortgage market organizations, in conservatorship. They're actually run by the federal government. It's like akin to a failed company that's not in bankruptcy, but it's not in reorganization. It's just in purgatory, to use a good Catholic phrase. And here it is, it's 12 years later, Jason, and we've made no change. So I've been in Congress, it'll be 8 years at the end of the year. We've tried to find, both in the Obama administration through Secretary Lew and in the Trump administration through Secretary Mnuchin, an ability to try to come together and change direction. And we have not had that, and we've had no such direction from the Biden administration. And I say this because, sure, Congress can get together and work on it, but if you don't have a partner in the administration with the stick of the executive branch to say, we're going to fix Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and find consensus, you're really whistling past the graveyard on that project.
So are you recommending an end to the conservatorship or just a more active management of Fannie and Freddie?
I would be thrilled to have a plan for resolution of the conservatorship. And my views might not be shared with Senator Brown, but we ought to have that debate. And we had it in I'd say when the Republicans controlled the House, we had the debate. We didn't make much progress, but we had Democratic support. Jim Himes, now Governor Carney of Delaware, all working in the House. And then Senator Corker was very interested when he was in the Senate, and we've just lost that momentum. We need to find a way to have that conversation.
We talked about the block grants and Fannie and Freddie. I wonder whether HUD more broadly, what would the one or two most impactful things you think this administration could do at the HUD level to improve this perfect storm, as we said, between supply chain and interest rates and access to housing?
Well, people want two comments. One, I want to talk about Section 8, and then let's talk about public housing, and then thirdly, let's talk about housing affordability. On Section 8, I was a staffer on the Senate Housing Subcommittee in 1983 when the Section 8 program was envisioned and rolled out by HUD in the early Reagan administration. And the idea was, look, this is a way for someone to seek a better home in a better neighborhood, near a better school, near a job, and give flexibility and have it be essentially a blind benefit. It wasn't meant to find entire apartment complexes that are only voucher apartment complexes. That was never the intent of this program.
Was it a foreseen consequence?
I don't think so. No, because the idea was if you pay a market rent, let that person seeking a better life leave the city, go to the county, leave the city, go to another city, go to another neighborhood within the city, have that portability, have them in charge. And what I've seen is over the past 40 years, effectively, HUD doesn't pay a market rent. So the program is less effective. So what happens is we are now congregating voucher users into low-income apartment complexes, the exact opposite of what the mission of that program was. And then you find some people advocating for project-based vouchers, which I'm not against, but that wasn't really the intent of the program either, and those can be quite effective. But I think that reform there, if you said, what's the best reform, I would say, relook at the formula that says how HUD pays a market rent.
So it's
And
really,
I think you'll find more landlords then would find that a more appealing program. It's not about paying a security deposit or that the inspections drag their feet in HUD in inspecting the project. That contributes to it because that's big government dragging its feet, being bureaucratic about not approving whether this apartment complies with HUD rules or not. I think it, show me the money. I'm going to tell you, paying a market, having a more effective way to demonstrate you're paying a market rent would be the most powerful change on that one.
so it sounds like the funding, especially as expressed in those rent allotments, you put the bulk of the blame, if you will, for what's happened with the program on that. I expect community perceptions, et cetera, have contributed to where that's ended up.
There is no one answer there. I'm simply saying that if I were doing a weighted average on what contributes to fewer landlords, fewer entrepreneurial landlords participating, I think you'll find that paying that fair market rent in any given metro area is an issue. Housing affordability. Look, you can't federalize a solution to that. It's like coming to me and saying, hey, I don't like my police force. Why don't you do something about it? I said, well, why don't you do something about it? You have a city council, you have a quorum court, you have a mayor, you have a local political infrastructure. Why don't you reform your police department? It's not up to the federal government to do that. Likewise, when you say, oh, I can't build affordable housing in my community, why don't you look at all the things that might break down to doing that? I'm so pleased to live in a beautiful place like Little Rock, Arkansas, where a teacher or a first responder making $40,000 can buy a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house with a fenced backyard and be 20 minutes from work. I mean, I'm blessed with that situation. Not everybody else is, and I respect that. But let's break down the things locally before we start trying to have the federal government preempt and solve a problem that is really the origin of that problem is right there in that metro area. And then on public housing, I think the RAD program, which allows public housing to take the 1939 public housing units that are scattered over the country and replace those unit for unit, has been pretty successful. I think I hear from public housing officials, from tenants, from others that that's been a positive. But, are they mixing the units with today's society in an effective way? Is there space to do workforce training or access to Wi-Fi or school homework or after-school activities at that community area? I've been to San Bernardino, and I'd say the answer is 100% yes in those RAD projects out in California. In the RAD projects in my towns of Little Rock and North Little Rock, Arkansas, I would say no. Very modest, what I call community space. So we have some work we could do there.
What can we learn and improve on from the, call it the last 6-7 decades of public housing in the United States? I mean, you talk about local control, city councils, mayors, yet there's a well-documented history that it's not just de facto segregation, but it's been policy-driven segregation along racial lines and otherwise that's enforced and hardened some of the divisions in communities across America.
So this is why I'm not opposed to RAD in public housing, but are you really solving a problem there? No, you're still continuing to localize it, if you will. Leave it in the same geography, leave it in that same process, which is why in the, going 4 decades, I supported the voucher program, which gives individual freedom to individual families to try to better themselves. A low, moderate income family takes the part of that voucher that contributes into their monthly income and goes and finds a better situation. But we've, as I say, concentrated that program. That's a prime example of what you're talking about, where you're not offering, I think, a flexible equity, upward mobility type solution. So
I guess I'm wondering if that's where guidelines or parameters from the federal perspective would help ensure a more equitable.
Well, I mean, but then you say, the RAD program concentrates public housing tenants back in that same public housing location from a period in time that you're stipulating, I would say, that it was built there for racist purposes, right? So are you changing the dynamic? I don't think so. I mean, the Sergeant Shriver and the Lyndon Johnson program did more to segregate and create inequity in this society than anybody ever gives them credit for, because we think about Medicaid and Medicare as freeing positive social programs. But urban renewal is what people are railing against now, and that was a principal mission of the Johnson administration. So why don't we take RAD dollars and instead of doing those, why don't you tear down the public housing and let that property be redeveloped and let it go to a higher and better use, and maybe that money goes back in a revolving loan fund for HUD to build new housing, and take those dollars and put it in a true voucher program that lets people move around in a community and not be concentrated in a concentrated low-income neighborhood. I mean, but you can't do that if you just want to rinse and repeat, do the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, I hear the vision. I appreciate the need for a pivot from what policy has looked like. How do we do that at this moment, given the inflation and supply chain and other crises? I saw a statistic that I think for a $400,000 home, the mortgage on January 1st versus September 1st this year, $700 more a month for a family trying to buy a $400,000 home. Their mortgage payment goes up by $9,000 a year compared to where it was in January. What constraints does that put on the growth?
It's a huge constraint. It's why the inflation caused by the mistakes of this administration, contributed by the pandemic, I certainly will acknowledge that, have given this point. But we have to think through policy long run on what would be the best housing and community development policy. Bad economy, good economy, in and out. So any decision that we take is not going to resolve that mortgage disparity brought about by bad economic policies by the Federal Reserve and the federal government. So, to send your complaint, you send it to, Constitution Avenue, to the Fed and to the OMB and the White House. But what can we do? Look at all the benefits our states, when it comes to higher interest rates on the mortgage side, more people will need first-time home buyer assistance potentially. They'll need a bigger down payment, right? In my state, we have ample first-time home buyer down payment money. We use the bond program, and we constantly we have a surplus every year of trying to help people get that first-time home buyer assistance. But don't forget, we're also benefited by those lower costs I talked about initially. But you're not going to, in the short run, be able to hide from higher mortgage prices. And you'll see the market determine flexibility. When I bought my first house in the middle of the 1980s, in the highest inflation before this time, I had a famous thing called an adjustable rate mortgage. That was not a bad one, not evil, like they got their reputation in the 2005 crisis. And you saw headlines this last week. More and more people are going back to an ARM because they're making an intermediate decision. I'm doing household formation. We want to get married. We want to buy a home. With home buyer assistance and an ARM, we bridge the gap of this short-term crisis that we're in of inflation. And so there will be market reaction there, and people will have to be flexible. And I was glad to have that ARM. It allowed me to buy a home. I'd never owned one before. I'd been out of college, I guess, 10 years or something like that, close to it. I was getting ready to get married. And I paid something in the mid-1980s in the threes, but it had a maximum cap of 7 in those days. But I knew I wouldn't be in the house that long. You've got to make that kind of financial decision.
So in the short term, on the supply side, even with the ARM, with first-time home buyer assistance, home construction has been disrupted by the supply chain. You mentioned the lumber coming out of Arkansas.
Right.
What are you recommending, or what would you imagine would help from that standpoint of just creating more inventory for people to use ARMs and that home buyer assistance for?
Well, we're definitely, several million units short, and we were before we got into this crisis. We were short housing units for housing formation across the country. And we're a very mobile society, and so sometimes you get those dislocations. So again, what are the barriers to why people are not building more units in any metro area? And so that's why there's not one federal solution. We have federal dollars to try to help on the low moderate income side through HUD, through CDBG, and through state housing programs and through city housing programs. But again, if you want lower home construction costs, don't pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Don't pass American Rescue. Don't pass Inflation Reduction, because every one of those bills is driving up the cost of labor and materials. And you talk to people institutionally who are going to try to take advantage of some of the bipartisan infrastructure bills. They can't find labor. And now I actually had the highway department in my state come to me and say, well, we're glad to have the infrastructure bill, but now we won't be able to build what we planned on building because of inflation. I said, this is circular logic. We're creating this problem by the way we are passing all this money and trying to do it all in this short period of time. So we are our own worst enemy, I would say, on trying to lower housing construction costs. But they will come down, and in the meantime, cities and counties ought to be looking at ways to get out of the way, lower regulatory costs, increase policies that would make land to be entitled for single-family housing and multifamily housing more affordable.
I know we wanted to talk not just about housing, but also about the rental market. Rents are sky high. We see that in the headlines every day. According to HUD, the number of individuals with chronic patterns of homelessness went up 20% during the first to the second year of the pandemic. So you can imagine, as you said, this cycle, right? People are not able to get housed and have that stability. They're not able to then work for the Arkansas Highway Department and use that money. What are some of the things that you'd like to see happen in terms of more affordable rental housing?
Well, it gets back to that construction cost first and foremost. And, we have land entitlement costs to build multifamily is the number one issue about whether or not it's going to be affordable. So those land zoning rules, paying those development fees up front, the NIMBY issue of we don't want multifamily in our neighborhood, all that drives up rental housing costs. And during the pandemic, we tried to offset that with rental assistance, with the income assistance, with the Paycheck Protection Program. All that was putting money in people's pockets to try to maintain access to housing through rent, by being able to pay rent or make their mortgage payment. And those programs continue, and they're not even connected to the pandemic. We now, in the American Rescue Plan, pay your rent even if you don't have a burden from the pandemic, and we make a mortgage payment even if you don't have a burden from the pandemic. You just self-certify that you need help paying your mortgage, and Uncle Sam pays that through the states. So I hate to keep going back like I'm a broken record about the number one issue that causes rental housing costs to go up, and they're up dramatically. And so is single family prices. All that is connected to this spurt of inflation, and as inflation comes down, you'll see rents come down, you'll see those home prices come down, particularly in markets where you can't even connect the supply-demand increase, where you have 20, 30% price increases in some markets on housing over the last 2 years. And there's no underlying economic reason other than people with money who are seeking to, shift cities from the pandemic.
So we've talked about Fannie and Freddie and HUD and what you'd like to see from the administration. What advice near term would you give a constituent who is in a place like you, were 10 years out of college, trying to get their first home or trying to move into a city and take a higher paying job and find housing? What can home buyers and renters practically do until some of those reforms come about?
Well, for low moderate income families trying to obtain assistance to help resolve a rental issue, again, they have the ability to take advantage of some of these rental programs that are still out there. And we, again, for a low moderate income family that wants first-time home buyer assistance, I think there are robust plans to do that, including very effective FHA programs that are lower cost for first-time home buyers, for first responders, for people at moderate incomes with kids. So that's my advice there. And for someone who's buying a traditional home, I'd look at, depending on their income, home buyer assistance combined with an ARM might be a way to help a family in trying to buy their first house in a more expensive market. So those are certainly some ideas.
I appreciate the dialogue and want to open it up to questions, whether we have those from social media using the hashtag #TheHillHousing or here in the room on Capitol Hill. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks,
I
Jason.
appreciate it.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.
Appreciate it.